Content warning. This episode discusses kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. On the 12th of July, 1991, a young man named Dominic Murray opened a letter that had arrived at his house in Leeds. It was written in handwriting he recognized immediately because it belonged to his girlfriend. "Help me, please," it read. "I've been kidnapped, and I'm being held as personal security. Please go and tell my mum straight away." Her name was Julie Dart. She was 18 years old. 2 days earlier, she'd gone out for the night and simply never come home. And somewhere at that exact moment, a man who called himself the Bird, sometimes Mr. S, was watching the clock, waiting to see whether a family in Yorkshire could raise £140,000 fast enough to save her life. They couldn't. Nobody could have. 9 days later, a group of farmers working a field beside a disused railway line in Lincolnshire came across something that would end that particular waiting game and open up one of the most methodically planned and ultimately self-defeating criminal campaigns in modern British history. This is the story of a man who believed he'd worked out the perfect kidnapping twice. It's a story about two very different young women, one of whom never came home, and one of whose composure under unimaginable pressure very likely saved her own life, and, in the end, helped catch the man responsible for both crimes. Part 1. The man who planned everything. To understand what happened to Julie Dart and Stephanie Slater, you first have to understand the man who took them, because almost nothing about his crimes was impulsive. Everything was rehearsed, engineered, and adjusted after failure, the way an obsessive hobbyist refines a project across years rather than days. Michael Benham Sams was born in August 1941 in Keighley, in West Yorkshire. As a young man, he joined the Merchant Navy, serving for around 3 years before returning home to train as a heating and lift engineer. He eventually built his own small central heating business, the kind of steady, unremarkable trade that let a man move through a community largely unnoticed. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't obviously disturbed to the people who dealt with him day to day. He was a tradesman, a business owner, someone who fixed the boiler and sent the invoice. He also had a criminal record, stretching back years before anyone connected him to the disappearance of a Leeds teenager. In 1976, Sams was sent to prison for car theft and making a fraudulent insurance claim, a small-time offense, but one that showed, even then, a willingness to construct an elaborate lie and hold his nerve while telling it. Later in life, he would also become a person of interest, though never charged, in the disappearance of London estate agent Susie Lamplugh, who vanished in 1986 after leaving to meet a client referred to only as Mr. Kipper. That connection was never substantiated, and Sams was never charged in relation to Lamplugh's case, but it's a detail that speaks to how, for years, his name would circle in and out of some of Britain's most disturbing unsolved cases. By 1991, Sams was 50 years old, living a life that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. What almost nobody around him knew was that he had spent a considerable amount of time, using his engineering background and a rented lock-up workshop, designing something specific and, frankly, monstrous, a purpose-built holding container. A wooden box, coffin-like in shape, fitted inside a wheelie bin that could be laid on its side, designed to hold a human being in restrained, controlled conditions for an extended period. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision made after grabbing someone off the street. It was infrastructure, built in advance, for a crime he was already planning to commit, possibly more than once. Part 2. Julie Dart was 18 years old in the summer of 1991, living in Leeds. Like a lot of young women her age, at times she worked in the sex trade, a detail that matters for this story not because it explains anything about what happened to her, but because it's part of why Michael Sams selected her as a target in the first place. He appears to have deliberately chosen someone whose disappearance, he calculated, might not trigger an immediate, urgent search. Someone he assumed police and the public might be slower to treat as a genuine, high-priority victim. He was wrong about that, but it took tragically little time for that particular miscalculation to matter. On the 10th of July, 1991, Julie went out for the evening in Leeds and disappeared. Michael Sams had approached her, using the same false pretenses and calm, unthreatening manner that would define his method across both of his known abductions, and took her to his rented workshop, the same lockup where that wooden box waited, already built, already prepared. He forced her to write letters, including the one that would eventually reach her boyfriend, Dominic Murray, 2 days later, pleading with him to tell her mother and describing herself as being held for personal security, in language clearly dictated, at least in substance, by her captor. Sams's plan hinged on ransom. He wanted £140,000 from Julie's family in exchange for her safe return. But here is where the case takes its first genuinely devastating turn, because according to what Sams himself would eventually admit, years later, there had never really been a version of events where Julie survived this. In a recorded conversation with the lead detective on the case, made public in a later television documentary, Sams stated plainly, "When I went out to kidnap Julie Dart, there was only one intention, and that was to kill her. There was no intention whatsoever to keep her alive." It's an almost unbearable thing to sit with, that the letters, the instructions, the appearance of a ransom negotiation in progress may have been theatre from the very beginning. Julie Dart, according to her killer's own later words, was likely never going to walk out of that workshop alive, regardless of whether her family raised the money or not. At some point during her captivity, Julie attempted to escape. Sams responded with fatal violence, killing her with a hammer. 9 days after she'd first gone missing, he drove her body to a field near Grantham in Lincolnshire, alongside a disused railway line not far from where he'd later, chillingly, reused the same general area for a separate extortion attempt against British Rail. He left her there. A group of farmers working the field discovered her remains roughly 10 days after her disappearance. Julie Dart's murder was now a homicide investigation, and, for a period, it went cold. Part 3. 6 months of silence for half a year, Michael Sams went back to his ordinary life. He ran his business. He fixed boilers. And, according to what would later emerge, he also turned his attention to an entirely separate scheme, attempting to extort a substantial sum of money from British Rail, using a threat to sabotage rail lines, in a plot that echoed the same patient, engineering-minded approach he'd brought to Julie Dart's abduction. That extortion attempt against British Rail ultimately failed to pay off the way he wanted, but it's a telling detail about how Sams spent the months between his two known crimes. Not idle, not dormant, but actively running parallel criminal enterprises, testing which ones might work. Then, in January 1992, he decided to try the kidnapping model again, this time with a different kind of target entirely, and, chillingly, using the exact same workshop and the exact same handmade box. Part 4. Stephanie Slater was 25 years old, working as an estate agent for Shipways in Birmingham. It was, on paper, about as unremarkable and safe a job as you could imagine, showing prospective buyers around houses that were up for sale. It was also, as it turned out, a job that came with an inherent and rarely discussed vulnerability: meeting strangers, alone, inside empty properties. On the 22nd of January, 1992, a man calling himself by a false name booked a viewing of a house in the Great Bar area of Birmingham. Stephanie went to meet him, as she'd done countless times before for countless other clients. The man was Michael Sams. Once inside the property, Sams produced a knife, restrained Stephanie, and forced her into his car. He drove her back to the same lock-up workshop where, 6 months earlier, he had held Julie Dart, and placed her inside the same wooden box, inside the same wheelie bin laid on its side. She was handcuffed, gagged, and blindfolded. This time, Sams's demand was explicit and immediate. He wanted £175,000 from Stephanie's employer in exchange for her safe release. And this time, critically, and for reasons that likely saved Stephanie's life, Sams made an early, significant mistake. During a phone call to arrange the ransom, he failed to disguise his voice. It was ordinary, distinctive, and it was about to become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case, even though nobody realized it yet. What followed was 8 days of almost unbearable tension. For Stephanie, trapped inside a box she couldn't see out of, and for a police operation trying to orchestrate a ransom handover without anyone getting killed. Part 5. The Drop Police mobilized an enormous operation around the ransom exchange. Reports suggest as many as 1,000 officers were involved in the surveillance effort surrounding the attempt to catch Sams during the money drop. Shipway's managing director, Kevin Watts, was tasked with actually delivering the cash, following Sams's instructions to the letter while officers attempted to track his movements from a careful distance, hoping to catch Sams the moment he collected it. Sams, though, had planned this part with the same obsessive attention to detail he'd brought to every other stage of the operation. He directed Watts along a specific route, timed and structured in a way that meant any officer attempting to follow closely enough to make an arrest would be immediately, obviously visible. It worked. Sams managed to evade the surveillance net entirely, collecting, or at least attempting to collect, the ransom without being caught in the act. It's worth pausing on how genuinely unusual this is in the history of kidnap for ransom cases. Most ransom drops fail for the kidnapper, precisely because coordinating a clean handover while evading a police presence is enormously difficult. Sams pulled it off, at least in that moment, a fact that speaks to just how much thought he had put into every stage of this crime, treating the entire operation less like a violent crime of opportunity and more like a project to be engineered, tested, and refined. And yet, despite successfully collecting the money, despite outmaneuvering a huge police operation, Sams made a decision that, looking back, is genuinely difficult to reconcile with the man who had shown Julie Dart no mercy whatsoever. He let Stephanie Slater go. Part 6. 8 days to understand why. You have to look at what happened during Stephanie's 8 days in captivity. Because unlike Julie Dart, who Sams had apparently decided to kill before he'd even taken her, Stephanie's captivity seems to have unfolded very differently. Stephanie was raped by Sams during her imprisonment, a fact established clearly in the subsequent legal record, and one this script won't minimize or soften. Her captivity was violent, terrifying, and a profound violation carried out by a man who had already proven, with Julie Dart, exactly what he was capable of when he decided someone's life didn't matter to him. And yet, according to accounts given after her release, Stephanie appears to have made a series of extraordinarily composed, deliberate choices throughout her captivity, engaging with Sams, talking to him, and in doing so, seeming to shift, even if only slightly, how he regarded her. Multiple accounts of the case describe this as Stephanie developing a form of rapport with her captor during those 8 days, not because of any illusion about who he was or what he'd done, but as a calculated survival strategy, the same kind of psychological tactic that has helped other kidnapping and hostage victims make it out alive when direct resistance would likely have gotten them killed. It's widely understood by those who later studied and wrote about this case that this composure very probably saved her life. There's another layer to Stephanie's survival that's worth sitting with, because it says something remarkable about her presence of mind under conditions designed specifically to disorient her. She was blindfolded for virtually the entirety of her captivity. She never saw Sam's face, never saw the inside of the workshop with her own eyes. And yet, when she was eventually debriefed by police, her recollection of sounds, textures, distances, and sequences of movement from inside that workshop turned out to be remarkably precise. She'd been building a mental map the entire time, using every sense except sight, in case she ever got the chance to help police find the place she'd been held. After 8 days, Sams drove Stephanie to a location near her home, blindfolded, and released her. Part 7. The unraveling Stephanie's release didn't end the investigation. If anything, it accelerated it. Police now had a living witness who had spent over a week in close proximity to her kidnapper, and Stephanie provided investigators with an extraordinarily detailed account, not just of what she'd heard and felt inside the workshop, but a working description of the man himself, built from the brief moments she had glimpsed him and the sound of his voice. That description was combined with another crucial piece of the puzzle, a witness who had noticed Sams's car near the scene of the kidnapping and was able to provide investigators with a detailed account of both the vehicle and its driver. Between the witness's description and Stephanie's own recollections, police worked with an artist to produce a composite image of the suspect and connected the case, through obvious methodological similarities, to the unsolved murder of Julie Dart 6 months earlier, along with the earlier failed extortion attempt against British Rail. Police took their composite image and the details of the case to BBC's Crime Watch, the long-running program that had already featured an appeal in connection with Julie Dart's murder months before. It was watched that night by a woman named Susan Oak, Michael Sams's first wife. She recognized him, not from an artist's rough approximation of a stranger's face, but from a lifetime of familiarity with a man she'd once been married to. Small mannerisms, distinguishing details, things that only someone who had actually known him could pick out with confidence. She phoned the tip line and identified him by name. It's a detail that gives this case one of true crime's more quietly devastating ironies. A man who had engineered his crimes with genuine, patient skill, who had evaded a 1,000-officer surveillance operation, who had built custom equipment months in advance, who had avoided leaving Julie Dart's body anywhere he could be easily connected to, was ultimately undone by the one thing meticulous planning can't account for: being recognized by somebody who'd once loved him. Police arrested Michael Sams. According to one account of the arrest, when officers approached him and formally identified themselves, Sams initially insisted they had the wrong man, before ultimately going with them, reportedly wearing the stunned expression of a man who couldn't quite process that his elaborate, carefully engineered plan had actually failed. Part 8. The trial. Michael Sams did not go quietly into a guilty plea. He admitted to the kidnapping of Stephanie Slater. The evidence, by that point, was simply overwhelming. But he denied murdering Julie Dart, forcing the case to trial at Nottingham Crown Court in 1993. Stephanie Slater herself gave evidence during the proceedings, appearing at Nottingham Crown Court to describe what had happened to her. A young woman standing in a courtroom, testifying against the man who had held her in a box for 8 days, in order to help secure justice not only for her own ordeal, but for a teenager she had never met, who hadn't survived to tell her own story. The jury wasn't persuaded by Sams's denial regarding Julie Dart. He was convicted of her murder, alongside the kidnapping of Stephanie Slater and related blackmail charges. In 1993, Michael Sams was sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment. It didn't end there, notably. In the years following his conviction, Sams continued to generate headlines from behind bars, including, in the mid-1990s, an attack on a female probation officer inside the prison system, for which he received an additional 8-year sentence, and a later hostage-taking protest within the prison itself. Whatever combination of control, grievance, and calculation had driven his original crimes did not appear to fully dissipate simply because he was now behind bars. In the years following his trial, Sams also gave a form of post-conviction confession to journalists, a decision one contemporary report characterized as motivated less by genuine remorse than by an apparent desire to shape public perception of himself, to be seen, in his own words, as not brutal. It's a detail that tracks with everything else we know about how Michael Sams operated throughout this entire case. A man deeply, consistently preoccupied with control over his victims, over the narrative of his crimes, and even, eventually, over how history would remember him. Part 9. What came after Stephanie Slater's life after her release could easily have been defined entirely by trauma. And there's no question the 8 days she spent in that box shaped the rest of her life in ways that never fully faded. But what she chose to do with that experience says a great deal about who she was as a person. In the years that followed, Stephanie Slater became an active advocate and resource for other kidnapping victims, working alongside police forces across the country to help inform how officers approached hostage negotiation and victim support in cases like her own. Someone who had every reason to withdraw entirely from any further contact with crime, policing, or public attention, instead chose, repeatedly, to use what had happened to her to make things better for whoever might go through something similar in the future. Stephanie Slater died in 2017 at the age of 50 after being diagnosed with cancer. She had spent a quarter of a century turning an unimaginable experience into something that helped other people, a legacy that stands in stark, deliberate contrast to the man who put her in that box in the first place. Julie Dart never got the chance to build any kind of legacy of her own. She was 18 years old. She went out for a night in Leeds and never came home, and the letter she was forced to write to her boyfriend, pleading for someone to tell her mother what had happened, remains one of the most quietly devastating pieces of evidence in the entire case. A young woman, in the middle of what would become the final days of her life, still thinking about how to protect the people she loved from the shock of not knowing. As for Michael Sams, now in his 80s, and having spent well over 3 decades in prison, his case has continued to resurface periodically through the parole system in the years since his conviction, each time reopening the same questions for the families involved. What a life sentence should actually mean, and what, if anything, could ever be considered sufficient after 2 crimes built with this much cold, deliberate planning. Julie Dart was 18 years old. Stephanie Slater was 25. One of them didn't survive a crime built, by its perpetrator's own later admission, without any real intention of letting her live. The other survived 8 days inside a box through sheer, extraordinary composure, and then spent the rest of her life trying to make sure other victims might survive too. Thank you for listening.